any disease you can think of that's chronic and progressive, it's being caused by hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, and chronic inappropriate levels of inflammation. Your default setting is good health. And if you're not enjoying good health, you're doing something that's tripping up your body, that's tripping up your metabolism, that's tripping up your physiology. But the instant that somebody is like, okay, fine, I'll try this for 30 days. I'll do 60, I'll do 90. When they make that commitment, that's when the seeming magic begins. And as soon as you start to do that, your body, no matter how sick it is currently, immediately it says, thank you, I'll get to work healing now. Well, I know somebody right now listening to this, their head is exploding. They're like, this doctor just said to eat more fat to lose fat. How the hell does that make sense?
Ken, I want to start off talking about this new study. And this is all about the connection between, supposedly, I should say, red meat and type 2 diabetes. You did a video on this, and I'd just love to hear your thoughts and discuss.
Yeah, so first of all, we need to establish kind of some ground rules. If someone from the Harvard School of Public Health said, hey, Jesse, don't drink water anymore like you just did. I know, we've been drinking water for millions of years, but there's this new study out now, this observational study, and we looked at 216,000 people, and we found that you actually, drinking water causes type 2 diabetes. Okay? Now, you'd be like, what? So literally the thing we've been drinking since we've been in existence on this planet now causes type 2 diabetes. What's the mechanism? How is that even possible? And then when you dig into the study, you find out that people who drink the most water have a 1.4 hazard ratio of developing type 2 diabetes versus the people who drink Coke instead of water. And you're like, well, that's a tiny hazard ratio. I mean, so that's literally what this study from the Harvard School of Public Health, one of the senior authors is Professor Walter Willett. They have come out and said that red meat increases your risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And so just with the same as with the water analogy, or if they came out with a study saying, hey, breathing real air increases your risk of type 2 diabetes, you need to start breathing New York City air, and that'll be somewhat protective. You'd be like, what? Well, that literally human beings have been eating red meat for almost as long as we've been breathing air and drinking water. As a specific species, Homo sapiens sapien, we've been eating meat as much as we could get for exactly as long as we've been drinking water and breathing clean air. And so on its face, right off the bat, this is an exceptional claim. You see what I'm saying? This is not just maybe. This is an exceptional, extraordinary claim. And our one of my heroes, and probably yours, Sagan, said, if you make an extraordinary claim, then you need to have extraordinary evidence to back that claim up, or otherwise I'm going to ignore you. And so in order to say that red meat ingestion increases your risk of developing type 2 diabetes, you're going to need a randomized controlled trial that goes on for 5 or 10 years in human beings with a large number of participants in the study. Then I might take your claim seriously. I would still need more research, but I would at least take it seriously and go, crap, maybe I've missed something here. But you're going to come at me with a prospective cohort study, which is an epidemiological study, which by its very definition doesn't prove anything. That's where we're at with this, Jesse. That's what's going on here. They're literally saying drinking clean water and breathing clean air and eating red meat will increase your risk of diabetes. And here's the weakest of all scientific research, an observational study that barely shows a possible association. And so just to give people some context, back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when scientists were really looking into tobacco smoking and its link to lung cancer. When they would do an observational study and follow people, they would wind up with a hazard ratio of 15, of 20, of 25, of 30. Huge hazard ratio. And they use that evidence to say, dude, it's highly likely that smoking cigarettes increases your risk of lung cancer. And so now when we look at this study, it has a hazard ratio of not 24, not 14, but 1.4. And for your listeners who don't read a lot of epidemiological research, a hazard ratio of 1 means it has literally no effect whatsoever. It's a non-issue. And so this is 1.4. But if you look at CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, they'll have headlines like eating red meat linked to developing type 2 diabetes. Well, that implies a causation, doesn't it? Just the language they use. Or the more red meat you eat, the higher your risk. Again, implying causation, like, oh, this study definitively proved that. And I think part of that is just laziness on the part of the science reporters at these, if they even still have a science reporter anymore. I'm not sure. They've probably been laid off. But so they take the results of this study, and then also Harvard released a press release about this study and implied that this is a very strong association, 1.4 hazard ratio. They literally said very strong association. This is foolishness. So anybody with a bachelor's degree in any kind of scientific field who's taken a statistics class know immediately that a hazard ratio of 1.4, that's about as weak as it gets. That's not in any way a strong association. That is in no way implies causation. And so very, very intelligent scientists, some within the health and nutrition sphere, have already published posts or they've tweeted about this study like, aha, I knew it. This red meat, man, here it is. Here's another study. And so my friend Sean Baker, he makes a great analogy. If you've got a shovel full of bovine excrement, and then you put another shovel of bovine excrement and another shovel, and you just keep shoveling, then you'll finally have a huge pile of bullshit. But that doesn't mean that the bullshit proves anything. You can have 500 studies like this, and it doesn't prove anything. And it still just shows a possible weak association. And so this has been so heavily covered by the mainstream media that the average person is probably scared to death right now to eat red meat. And it's very unfortunate because red meat is an ancestral food for Homo sapiens sapien. It's something we've been eating our entire existence as a species on this planet. It's nutrient dense. It's very uninflammatory. When you eat fatty red meat, when you eat that instead of eating a high carbohydrate, highly inflammatory choice, your health actually improves. And two other things about this study that are just complete foolishness is, number one, they don't talk about a possible mechanism, how it could be doing that, which any study like this is going to say, it's our opinion that this is the biological or physiological mechanism by which this is occurring. And they don't really address that at all. I find that incredibly telling. And then secondly, as you know, Jesse, there's a huge population, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of people who have been eating only red meat in the carnivore community, that some have been doing this for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And so if they wanted to do some kind of, not even a control, but just a comparison study of, let's see, the people who are eating a vegan diet, that's the most extreme of anti-red meat, versus people who eat several servings of red meat every single day, several pounds in many cases of red meat every single day. Let's see what the incidence of prediabetes, of type 2 diabetes, of hyperinsulinemia is in these two self-selected groups, yes, but in many cases, the carnivores are carnivores because they had type 2 diabetes. And so they figured out that if they eat only meat, not only will their type 2 diabetes get better, but it'll go completely away, and it'll stay away as long as they continue to eat nothing but meat. And so I find this study ludicrous on so many points that I'm a common sense country guy, even though I'm a family doctor. I still, things have to make sense. And at this point, I mean, we're talking about PhD researchers with decades of experience at the Harvard School of Public Health. They have to know this is a very, very weak, very poorly done study that doesn't prove a thing. And instead of reaching out to the mainstream news organizations and saying, hey, CNN, our study didn't prove that red meat caused diabetes. We didn't say that. You need to change you need to retract that, or you need to change your title or edit the article because we didn't say that. They haven't done any of that. They're just letting this build out in society. And so at some point you've got to go, what's really going on here, Jesse? Why are they putting this out as state of the art causation level research and then letting everyone believe that? At some point you've got to go, there's must be some other motive here besides helping people not develop type 2 diabetes.
If you're enjoying the episode, take a second and let me know by clicking like and subscribe below. Thank you so much, and now back to the episode. You said something there where people with type 2 diabetes are using an all-meat diet to actually reverse the condition. I want to get to that in a second, but let's set the scene of somebody that develops type 2 diabetes. What is actually happening in the body over years to get to that point, and then we'll talk about reversal.
Yeah, so the most likely thing, and I don't think anybody knows for sure, but the most likely theory is that if you continuously, meal after meal, day after day, eat a high carbohydrate diet, all carbohydrates turn into sugar. All carbohydrates are made of sugar. And the only carbohydrates that don't break down into sugar in your body is insoluble fibers. All the starches, all of them break down into literal sugar. In many cases, they start to do this in your mouth before you even swallow them because you have an enzyme called amylase that is in your saliva. And so somebody, if they're like, no, whole wheat bread doesn't have any sugar in it, you can just take a bite of whole wheat bread. I mean, the organic, non-GMO, ancient wheat bread. I'm not talking about white bread, right, from Save-A-Lot. And chew it 50 times and then take a glucose detector strip. You can buy these at the pharmacy and just touch it to your tongue and watch it turn. You've already started to break down the starch in the bread to sugar. When you eat a diet like that every single day, and many people following a plant-based diet are drinking fruit juice smoothies and eating whole grain bread and lots of fruits and vegetables. That's the way it's always said, right? Well, they're keeping their blood sugar constantly high, which is in turn going to keep their insulin level constantly high. So the insulin's trying to push this glucose into muscle cells and other cells, try to get it out of the bloodstream because it's very damaging if it stays in your bloodstream. And the way we know this is because of type 1 diabetics before we had insulin decades ago. They would be dead by the age of 12, 15, maybe 20 if they were lucky because of the severe damage that's done by chronically high blood sugars. And so your pancreas produces more and more insulin trying to push this glucose out of the bloodstream so it's not damaging the eyes, damaging the brain, damaging the heart, damaging the kidneys. But if your cells are already full of glucose, there's nowhere else to push it. And so your pancreas just keeps making more and more insulin in this blind attempt to get the glucose out of your bloodstream. Well, after years and years of that, your A1C starts to elevate because for the first few years, your pancreas can push enough of it out to keep your blood sugar close to normal. But after years and years of that, your pancreas just can't do it. And it's not that your pancreas burns out or stops making insulin. 95% of the time in type 2 diabetics, that's not true at all. If you check an insulin level, they're making not only a normal amount, but way more than they should be making because they're eating so many carbohydrates. This is a pretty well-established mechanism here. We've kind of known this since the 1930s, 1940s, that if you eat too much saccharine, that's the old word for it. Now we would just call it sugar in any form, any kind of carbohydrate, you're going to eventually develop type 2 diabetes. Now, some people do this much more quickly than others. Some people within 6 months of adopting a high carbohydrate diet, they're going to have prediabetes. Some people it takes 6 years. Some people it takes 20 years. But we all are moving towards that, moving in that direction if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet. And so, if for your listeners who are not nutritionists or dietitians, meat is the lowest carbohydrate food on the planet that you can eat that's still nutrient dense. And so to imply that eating red meat increases your risk of type 2 diabetes, it flies in the face of every physiological mechanism we know about human glucose and insulin and glucagon metabolism.
Well, let's take this story even further and talk about the playbook for somebody that is in that position of having type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance, which is along that continuum. So, what you're saying here, and I want to further expand, is that meat doesn't raise insulin, doesn't spike blood glucose. So, obviously, a big part of this is to change the diet. We want to eliminate carbs or at least bring the carbs down. Naturally, we're going to increase the meat to fill in the gap when it comes to calories
Right.
and substance.
You have to eat something.
Yeah. So let's talk about how far we need to take that. If we're eating like a regular type diet now and we want to start reversing this, at one end of the continuum is carnivore, no carbs. But typically, how far does somebody need to push it in the no carb realm or low carb to start to get the benefits and reverse things?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, let me correct one little thing that we missaid earlier. So eating meat does raise your insulin a modest amount, but it doesn't raise it nearly as high as eating a starchy carbohydrate. Fat, pure fat, barely increases your insulin level at all. So we have the three macronutrients, carbohydrates, fat, and protein. The carbohydrates spike your insulin because it turns into pure sugar, and your insulin has to do something with that. Protein does raise your insulin a modest amount. Fat barely raises it at all. So with that being said, there is this concept in all of biology, but it applies to human biology as well. It's known as the normal distribution curve, right? And so most people are going to fall here. A few people will fall here, and a few people will fall here. And that applies to everything you can talk about in animal biology and therefore human biology. So there are some people who are eating 200 or 300 grams of carbohydrates, total carbohydrates a day. But they're doing that because they're following the American Diabetes Association's handout. And they're making the recipes on the American Diabetes Association website. And they're not a dietitian. They're not counting carbs. They don't know. Now, type 1 diabetics have to count the carbs, and they have to also count the grams of protein because both of those will raise your insulin. And they have to adjust their insulin intake to accommodate that. So some people, what I would recommend for anybody who's currently a type 2 diabetic is to either download either Carb Manager or Chronometer. And I'm sure there's other macro trackers you can download and use for free on your phone. And the first thing I want you to do is track how many total carbohydrates you're eating a day, and do that for a week or two. Now you've got your baseline because everybody's different. Some people are eating 150 grams a day. Some people are eating 350 grams a day. So the first thing you need to know as a type 2 diabetic is how many total carbs am I eating a day? Now you've got a number to work with. That's kind of your benchmark. So I'm currently eating 350 grams of total carbohydrates a day, and my A1C is currently 11, let's say, right? Which is terrible. Okay, now what you're going to do is you're going to cut that down. Cut it back to 200 grams or 150 grams a day. That's still going to give you plenty of room for vegetables, even a slice of whole grain bread if you want that, for some fruits, for some nuts. And then also I hope you're including fatty red meat in that diet as well, because you need the nutrition contained in meat. And so then you're going to recheck your hemoglobin A1C every 3 months. And so after 3 months of going from, say, 250 grams of carbs a day down to, then you're going to do 3 months of 150 total grams of carbs max. Then you're going to go back to your doctor and you're going to get your hemoglobin A1C. And I also want you to ask for a fasting insulin as well every time you ask for an A1C. Now, if you're currently injecting insulin, then you can't check a fasting insulin. That'll give you a false value. You're going to check a C peptide. Okay, that is a proxy marker for how much insulin your pancreas is secreting, and it's not affected by exogenous insulin that you might be injecting or inhaling. And so then let's say now your A1C's come down to 8. Boom, that's a great improvement, but you're not where you want to be yet. So now you're going to go from 150 total a day down to 100 or 75 total grams of carbs a day. Do that for 90 days, then recheck the A1C and the fasting insulin. What is it now? Let's say, now it's down to 6.2. Huzzah! That's a great improvement. Now you're no longer type 2 diabetic. Now you only have pre-diabetes. Great victory. You're decreasing the amount of damage done to every small artery in your body by orders of magnitude. This is a huge improvement, but you're not there yet. So then let's say, okay, you're like, well, I want a normal A1C. By George, I deserve that. I agree. So now you're going to cut it down to 50 total grams of carbs a day. And then do it for 90 days. And then recheck those 2 tests. Let's say it's down to 5.7 now. Man, you're so close, because 5.6 is normal. You still got the tiniest touch of pre-diabetes now. And so that's why most people wind up on a proper human diet spectrum, which is anywhere from 100 total grams of carbs a day. For some people, that'll reverse their type 2 diabetes. Some people have to go to 50 total grams. Some people have to go to 20, which is ketogenic. Some people have to go to 10, which is ketovore. Some people have to go to as close to 0 carbs a day as they can get to get their A1C back to normal, and that is a carnivore diet. So this spectrum, you're going to have some people that 100, that does it. Most people somewhere between 20 and 70, that's going to get them out of the type 2 diabetes danger zone. But some people on this end of the normal distribution curve are going to have to go 10 total grams or less a day in order to reverse their type 2 diabetes. And so that it's very simple. And that's the beauty of it, Jesse, is that you don't need a degree in nutrition. You don't need a degree in epidemiology. You just figure up your total carbs and then cut it in half. Wait 3 months, check the test. If that did it, huzzah. If that didn't do it, cut it in half again, and keep doing that until you wind up with a normal A1C, and probably just as importantly, also a normal fasting insulin. When you've got those two numbers normal, then you know you're eating a species specific, but also individual specific, proper amount of total daily carbohydrate.
I'm glad you clarified at the beginning there that piece of meat still having a response with insulin.
Yeah.
I'm curious, as you say that, getting to think about the physiology and nuance there, does that come from gluconeogenesis or glycogen that's within that muscle meat, or a combination of the two? I'm just trying to understand what's going on there.
A combination of those two, but they're probably minor players. But so insulin is a hugely important hormone in the human body. It does push glucose out of the bloodstream into the cells, and many people think that's its primary job, but it also does hundreds of other things as well, one of which is protein metabolism, helping you break that protein down and get it where it needs to be. And so there's multiple reasons that eating just like a skinless, boneless chicken breast, that's going to raise your insulin a modest amount, not the spike you see with carbs. But the insulin has many, many jobs in the human body. And one of them is helping to put the protein where it goes when you've ingested it. And actually, people find when they're on a carnivore or a ketogenic diet that if they'll eat a fatty cut of red meat, like a type 1 diabetic, if they're doing keto or carnivore, they don't have to inject as much insulin as if they eat a low-fat or a fat-free cut of meat, like fat-free turkey deli meat or a boneless, skinless chicken breast. They actually have to inject a little more insulin with that load of protein than they would if the protein were paired with the fat that occurs with the protein naturally. So if you're eating a chicken breast, leave the skin on and leave the bone in, and you won't have to inject as much insulin that way because the fat helps to moderate that.
I'm glad when you got into the testing, you specified there the importance of testing for fasting insulin and hemoglobin A1C.
Yes.
The way I understand it, typically a conventional doctor wouldn't test the fasting insulin. Is
Right.
that correct? Yeah.
Yeah. So there are still doctors out there, despite my years of YouTube harping, that won't check an A1C. Patients have to argue with their doctor. If their fasting glucose is normal, their doctor won't say, well, why would you even want an A1C? Your glucose is normal. And the patient's reply is, yeah, but dude, I've been fasting for 12 hours. I could have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes and my fasting glucose still be normal. You know that, right, doctor? This is a literal conversation that some people have to have with a doctor who's behind on his or her reading. But then the average doctor, even today, after me being on YouTube for 5 years, yelling from the rooftops about check a fasting insulin, they're like, I'm not checking a fasting insulin. You're not a type 1. You don't, there's no reason for that. And so the patient has to explain to the doctor, as if the doctor is an elementary school student, why they need their fasting insulin checked, because it is indeed possible. Let's say, for instance, you're taking glyburide or glimepiride or glipizide for your type 2 diabetes or for prediabetes. So they work by actually forcing your pancreas to produce more insulin. That's how they work. Okay, it doesn't cure the diabetes or improve the diabetes in any way. It just makes you hyperinsulinemic. Well, if you just check a fasting blood sugar on somebody with prediabetes who's taking glyburide, their fasting blood sugar is going to be normal. If you check an A1C, it may just be normal or barely elevated. But if you check a fasting insulin on them, their fasting insulin may be 40 or 50, which reveals immediately that, number one, their pancreas is having to work triple time, quadruple time to keep that A1C as low as it is and to keep the fasting blood sugar as low as it is. Well, if a doctor has any common sense at all, they would say, well, why in the hell is their pancreas having to make so much insulin? Wonder what's making that necessary. And then for many doctors, the next logical step is, well, maybe if I tell them to cut back on the carbohydrates in their diet, their pancreas won't have to work triple time making extra insulin to push that glucose out of the bloodstream into muscle cells and other places. And so for many doctors, that's been their epiphany, is when a patient basically says, look, either check my fasting insulin or I'm going to find a new doctor. And then they do that because a fasting insulin can actually predict type 2 diabetes 10 years before the patient even develops it. And the average doctor doesn't know that. But when a doctor has got 3 or 4 patients who've seen my YouTube videos and they're like, no, you're going to check a fasting insulin. And then they do that. And then they see that, they might start checking fasting insulins on other people as well. And when they see somebody with a fasting insulin of 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and that's very common for people eating a high carbohydrate diet, they can actually catch somebody who's on the direct route to developing type 2 diabetes and say, hey, lower get rid of all the starches and desserts and stuff and fruit juices, and boom, the fasting insulin comes back down, either normal or near normal. Well, you just added another 20 years to that person's life before they develop type 2 diabetes. And once doctors see the utility of a fasting insulin, they start checking it on everybody because it gives you a 10-year look into the future at what's going to happen to that patient's metabolic health. And most doctors are very happy once they get it. Once they understand what's going on, they're very happy to have that tool, and they start checking fasting insulins on everyone. But many doctors practicing right now today in 2023 are not going to check a fasting insulin unless you're prepared to stand up for your patient rights and your human rights and say, no, you either check it or I'm going to find another doctor.
Yeah, it's important we're getting into all this nuance because, like you're saying there, somebody's blood sugar can be awry for like 10 years and they're building up insulin resistance. The body's compensating by producing more insulin, keeping the blood sugar down, making it look like everything's good. But right away, if you trump all those other tests and go right to the fasting insulin, you can see what's happening years before. So just highlighting there and expanding upon that because of the importance.
Absolutely. And there's also checking a patient's triglycerides, which many doctors do, but they don't check it in concert with the fasting insulin. And so many patients have been told, many people in our private group, their doctor literally told them, look, your triglycerides are 400, 500, 600. You've got to cut back on the animal meat, the red meat, the saturated fat. And once the patient understands through our teachings what actually causes an elevation in triglycerides, they're like, how does a board certified medical doctor not know that saturated fat doesn't increase your triglycerides. That's not what does it. It's carbohydrates, and your body's attempting to turn that into triglycerides and then store that as fat in your body. That's where high triglycerides come from. But the average doctor, once they get through their third year of medical school, this is very important for everybody to understand. Up until the third year of medical school, anatomy and physiology, biochemistry, cell and molecular biology is pounded into their little medical school student brain. But starting the third year, when they start clinical rotations, the only thing they ever hear about after that till the end of their career in most cases is, what pharmaceutical are you going to prescribe for this? And what dosage? And which one should you not prescribe for this? And they just forget all the physiology because none of the people they look up to, their mentors, their professors, their chief residents, they don't talk about physiology anymore. They just talk about what's the latest and greatest diabetes medication you can prescribe for this patient. And you get points on the clinical rounds if you've prescribed the perfect diabetes medication or the newest diabetes medication. You get points for that. But seldom do you get anything but yelled at if you say, well, now I seem to remember back in my physiology textbook that saturated fat didn't really raise triglycerides. It was the glucose metabolism, carbohydrate metabolism, eating too many carbs. That's what raises triglycerides. You're not going to get a gold star for that in the hospital rounds.
Well, let's give people the ammunition they need to be able to explain this to their doc because, like you're saying, a lot of doctors aren't getting this information and people need to be their own advocate. And it's still common knowledge, unfortunately, that saturated fat is bad and it causes different issues. So let's get into the physiology, debunk that. We're done now, at least for now, with the diabetes piece in red meat. But let's move into saturated fat and explain what's going on there so people are properly equipped for themselves and if they have to have a conversation with their doctor.
Yep. So the same type of research that I was talking about with the red meat and diabetes, the observational, epidemiological, prospective cohort studies, that's exactly the same kind of studies that were done that proved that eating saturated fat, eating animal fat, eating red meat would increase your risk of heart attack, would increase your risk of stroke, would increase your risk of death. That's the same kind of research. And again, as I said earlier, human beings have been eating lots of fatty red meat since we have been a species on this planet. The entire 300,000 years. There isn't, and only after the agricultural de-evolution, I don't call it a revolution, it was a de-evolution because it actually harmed our health. Although it gave us as a species the ability to procreate more and for our population to explode and for things like governments and taxes and tax collectors and slavery and bondage. Those things were invented after we started the agricultural de-evolution. But human health actually got worse and continues to get worse to this very day. So that's the same kind of research. So again, as I said earlier, if you come at me with an extraordinary claim, red meat causes heart disease, saturated fat causes heart disease, that's an extraordinary claim. You're saying that something that humans have eaten for our entire existence on this planet has been bad for us this entire time. That's the claim. Saturated fat, animal fat. You better have some damn fine evidence, randomized controlled trials, maybe a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials to prove that to me. Otherwise, I'm going to ignore you. And so when I first started doing this 5 or 6 years ago, Jesse, I just believed when Harvard School of Public Health published something, I'd be like, okay, got it. I would just take it in and move on. I would only read the abstract. I didn't read the whole study. I'd forgotten my statistics training and my epidemiological training that we got in my undergraduate classes and also in the first year of medical school. We had a 1 hour a week class that kind of helped us understand statistics, but it wasn't nearly as much as it should have been. I would just take that at face value and be like, okay, Harvard wouldn't say it if it weren't true. And most people, I think, do that as well. They're like, well, I mean, if Harvard published a study and then the Wall Street Journal has an article about it, that sounds pretty reliable to me. Who am I? I'm a truck driver. I'm a hairdresser. I'm a waitress. I'm a factory worker, whatever. I don't know anything about this stuff. But this guy from YouTube and this guy, from podcast fame, they're telling me, no, you can't trust that anymore. And I think that you're right not to trust that anymore, to take all that with a huge grain of salt and do your own research about this stuff, because there are very, very excellent sources of information on YouTube and other social media that show clearly that this is not true. And Jesse, you know this, in the show notes of every one of my YouTube videos, including the one I just posted about type 2 diabetes being caused by red meat, down in the show notes are links to every bit of the research that I talk about, every bit of all the press releases, everything. I link everything because I want people to look it up for themselves, because you don't really have to be an epidemiologist or a dietitian or a doctor or a PhD. You don't have to be that to kind of sort this stuff out. When you realize that the bedrock assumption is that whatever food we were eating for the last 300,000 years, for 99% of our time on this planet, that's probably the best food for us to eat, because evolution is in fact the ultimate scientific experiment. If you're eating something is not helping you reproduce and evolve and grow and live, you will become extinct. And we see this multiple times in biology. This has happened multiple thousands, if not millions of times since life has been on this planet. If you get off into some eddy you get off into an evolutionary dead end, your species becomes extinct. But yet humans eating lots of fatty red meat are literally now the apex species on the planet.
Let's come back to the saturated fat story. I think it'd be helpful to go through the conventional story of how that leads to heart disease, and then we'll talk about the holes in that story, and then we'll correct it and talk about how too many carbs are actually what's causing that.
Yeah. So the main argument that the average primary care doctor uses on patients when it comes to eating saturated fat causes heart disease is they will literally say something like, eating all that saturated fat clogs up your arteries. And they'll even have a model on their countertop in the exam room showing this clogged up artery. See, this is cholesterol right here in the wall of the artery. If you eat foods high in cholesterol and high in saturated fat, you're clogging up. And using that word clog immediately brings up the analogy of your kitchen drain. And all people know that if you pour grease into your kitchen sink, when it cools down, it solidifies and it'll stop up your sink. We all know that. But people don't think through that simple analogy. First of all, we're not room temperature. We're 98.7 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Fat never solidifies in our body. First of all, if you just want to use that simple romper room illustration or analogy, that doesn't happen in our body. We're very warm-blooded. So, and then secondly, if you start to press the average primary care doctor on that, like, wait a minute, our body is not the same temperature, room temperature as a sink. That's not going to work. Plus, it should clog up our esophagus and our stomach and our intestines, not our arteries. Somehow it got into the circulation. How did it do that? If it clogged up, it should clog up my esophagus. I should starve to death. That's what saturated fat would do, if that's really true. Well, at that point, you've reached the end of your primary care doctor's understanding about the biochemistry of this and the physiology of this. At that point, they'll start to get emotionally upset with you. And that's a huge red flag that your doctor doesn't understand the science. Anytime a professional starts to get upset with you emotionally, that's a bad sign. That means they don't understand what they're talking about. They just basically threw you a line of crap and expected you to swallow it. And now that you're pushing back a little bit, you've reached the limit of their knowledge. And so that's why on my videos, I don't go in as much depth as other people do, because I'm just trying to get people to understand the basics of this. Because I'm talking to the patient. And then I'll let the patient talk to the doctor, because in many cases they've changed their doctor's mind and their doctor's now recommending a proper human diet. So that's what I enjoy doing, is talking to patients and be like, look, that doesn't make any sense. Do this for 90 days and then recheck your labs. And so what the doctor would say is, if you eat saturated fat, that's going to raise your total cholesterol. That's going to raise your LDL cholesterol. And now that total cholesterol has just about been completely shot in the head as a risk factor for heart disease, Now they only want to talk about LDL cholesterol. Well, as more studies are coming to light that were buried, we're starting to see that LDL cholesterol is probably a pretty poor marker for heart disease, right? Now they're starting to talk about things like ApoB and like LP little a and small dense particles. And it's like, okay, yeah, you keep finding a new test to talk about. And then we keep shooting that test in the head. Like you remember TMAO. That was huge for a minute. Oh, if you eat red meat, your TMAO will be high. That's going to cause heart disease. We know it. We've done the genomic studies. We just know it's a fact. You don't ever hear about TMAO anymore, do you? Because it fizzled out. It literally wasn't a predictor of anything. And so the same thing I predict is going to happen. It's already happened to total cholesterol. And now it's going to happen to LDL cholesterol. Then it's going to happen to LP little a. Then it's going to happen to ApoB. These things are not markers. They're not. They may be proxy markers of something going on in your metabolism, but they are not causative substances, causative molecules for heart disease. And I think is in the next few years, you'll start to see that very clearly that none of the vegan cardiologists are talking about ApoB anymore. They're not talking about LP little a. They'll be off talking about some new tests that they've discovered that proves that eating a plant-based diet is the best, healthiest diet for your heart. And then we'll debunk that test. And then you're going to see this moving goalposts as the carnivore and keto community continue to grow almost exponentially, because you've got such a large database now of people who've been eating literally saturated fat every day of their life, eating red meat every single day of their life for 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, 25 years. And you can check a CAC score, a coronary artery calcium score on them, and it's 0. You can check, and yeah, man, their total cholesterol and their LDL cholesterol is sky high, but their coronary arteries are clean as a whistle because their A1C is normal, their fasting insulin is normal, their triglycerides are normal, and their HDL cholesterol are all 4 normal. And their markers of inflammation, their CRP, sed rate, ferritin, homocysteine, and others, they're all normal. Their arteries are squeaky clean. And so then, because they're saying if you just think about this, Jesse, they're saying if you just 2 servings of red meat a week increase your risk of diabetes. That's the current study. The previous study was just 2 servings a week increase your risk of heart disease. Well, what do you do with somebody like Sean Baker, who's eating 3 pounds of red meat a day with the fat that comes with it? And he's been doing that for a decade, and his coronary arteries are clean as a whistle. How do you square that? Because if red meat is so dangerous that just 2 servings a week increase your risk, then somebody's eating 3 pounds of red meat a day, like Sean is, or like I am, our arteries ought to be riddled within just a year or 2 or 3, just completely destroyed by this fatty red meat diet. But yet we don't see that. And so at some point, I would expect the Harvard School of Public Health guys to say, let's compare. Let's take a cohort of 100 vegans and 100 carnivores, and let's follow them for 5 years. And let's follow their A1Cs and fasting insulins, and let's do CT angiograms on their heart, and let's do CIMTs, and let's just check everything on these 2 cohorts as they go forward into the future. Man, I would love it if they did that study, but I predict they won't. But even though it'd be a very easy study to set up and do, because vegans are very proud of their diet and they love their diet and they'll stick to it when nobody's watching, usually. Carnivores are very proud of their diet. They proclaim it from the rooftops on social media. They love their diet. They're going to stick to that carnivore diet almost without exception. And so you would know that you would have very high retention in both of these groups, and you could follow their metabolic markers through the years. And that would put this to rest forever. And so then the majority of people out there who are omnivores, that's what most people are. They eat some plants, eat some meat, whatever. They just eat whatever. Then you're saying, okay, we've got the 2 extremes here, the vegans and the carnivores. How do they do metabolically as time goes on? Because also you eliminate healthy user bias, don't you? Because both groups, they want their diet to be the best one. So neither group's going to be smoking. They're not going to be drinking much alcohol. They're going to be out there doing wind sprints or lifting weights or doing something. And so you eliminate all the biases that can slip into the research results by doing a study like that. And that's why I predict Harvard won't do that study.
All right, so you've made it clear saturated fat, red meat, they're not the culprits when it comes to heart disease. But let's talk about, we know a lot of people are affected by that, and it's a real issue in society these days. So let's talk about the truth of what's happening there.
Probably the vast majority of heart disease is caused from eating or breathing in things that damage the glycocalyx on the inside of arteries and the vasa vasorum, which is the tiny little vasculature that wraps around most arteries and goes through the arterial wall to actually feed the inner membranes of the artery. When something is inflammatory, it causes inflammation. And there's actually studies that show that the glycocalyx, which is this tiny little cilia inside of the artery wall, inside of the artery, in the lumen, that they do thousands of things. They do the glycocalyx does things that we have not even discovered yet. That's my prediction. We'll see how that prediction goes in 10 years. But when you eat a highly inflammatory, high carb, sugar filled meal, or drink a Coca-Cola, or drink a fruit juice smoothie, we can actually see the glycocalyx just become inactive. It either sheds off or just becomes completely paralyzed after that high carb inflammatory meal. That's a big deal, but the average lipidologist, they don't want to talk about that at all. They just want to talk about the saturated fat. So the vast majority of the damage is done by causing inflammation and damage to the tiny arterioles and the capillaries that feed every single cell in our body. And that damage is caused by a high carbohydrate inflammatory diet. So you wind up with high blood sugar, high insulin, and high levels of inflammation. Those are the three horsemen of heart disease, also of brain disease, also of kidney disease, liver disease, any disease you can think of that's chronic and progressive. It's being caused by hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, and chronic inappropriate levels of inflammation. That's what's causing all of it. And that's why when you remove the high carb foods and remove the inflammatory foods, everything goes back to normal, because it's vital that everybody understand this. The default setting on your body, and I'm talking to you, all you guys, the default setting is good health. Okay. If it weren't, you would have died in childbirth, or you would have died in utero, or you would have died in childhood. You are set. That's your default setting. Only to the degree with which you slowly poison yourself, either by ingesting pollution in the form of high carb inflammatory foods, or breathing pollution, or drinking pollution in the form of alcohol, will your health suffer. And that's why when somebody goes real whole food, meat heavy keto, or ketovore, or carnivore, they feel like it's almost miraculous. But it's not a miracle. It's physiology. You've basically removed all the things that are causing hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, and chronic inappropriate inflammation. You've removed those things out of your diet. And most people try to breathe clean air. Most people try to drink clean water. Most people try not to smoke. And so once you've removed all the pollution, whether edible or not, your body starts to heal. And it's not a miracle. It's just that your body's default setting is to be healthy. And so it starts to heal all the damage as best it can. And you go back to this level of health that for many people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s and beyond, they never dreamed they would have that level of health again. And that's why it feels miraculous. But it's not. It's just it's the physiology doing its job of trying to keep you healthy. And only when you batter it down so much with just too much food, too much pollution, too much alcohol, does it just give up and say, okay, I'm permanently damaged. I can never recover that degree of health again.
Let's come back to our vegans. And there is this group of people, and pretty large group of people online, that are on a plant-based only diet, which typically is pretty high carb. There is a group of them that are apparently doing very well on that diet when it comes to health and wellness. What do you think that is? Is it just short-term gains and then eventually things are going to dwindle? Or is it going from a standard type diet and this being an upgrade from that?
It's all that.
Like,
And
let's address what's going on there with these people that apparently are getting healthier on that diet.
absolutely. And I tell people all the time on social media, changing from a standard American junk diets to a vegan diet, that is a step in the right direction. It's the first step towards a proper human diet. And I love it when somebody goes vegan. I absolutely applaud them and I'm proud of them because that means they're thinking about food, Jesse. That means they're actually thinking before they consume. That's the biggest first step, I think. When you start to think about your food, you're a different person at that point. Then every morsel, you're like, wait a minute, what is this? That's good. That's a great first step. Now, if there's actually a study done by Neil Bernard, who's a noted vegan. He's got his own little agent, the Physicians Committee for Truth or something. I don't know about the truth part, but
responsible medicine.
That's it. Responsible medicine. Yeah, I don't know about the responsible part, but he actually did a study that showed that people, when they adopted a vegan diet, their A1C improved. And for many people, that's absolutely the case. Their A1C may start out being 9 or 8. When they go on a whole food, plant-based vegan diet, it'll come down, but it'll only come down to 7 or 6.5, right? And so he published that study. He was proud of that. And I just tweeted yesterday, if the carnivore diet would only get your A1C down to 6.5 or 7, I would be ashamed. I definitely wouldn't publish that. I'd be looking for a new job. I'd be like, well, if that's as good as it does, I don't want to be associated with that. But he actually published that. And so, yes, a vegan diet can lower your A1C, but you will seldom see a vegan who was previously type 2 diabetic. They're very shy about sharing their current A1C because it's typically still elevated. It's still 5.9, 6.5, 6.9. It did come down from 14 because they stopped all the highly processed, just abject junk carbohydrates, and they started to eat much more complex carbohydrates. That slowed down the glucose uptake. There's a lot more fiber. Therefore, they're not eating as much non-fibrous carbohydrates. Yeah, and their A1C went from 11 down to 7 or 7.5. That is an improvement, absolutely, but you're not normal. You still have type 2 diabetes, or you still have bad pre-diabetes. And then one thing you'll never see the vegan share is their fasting insulin. And also, you'll never hear the vegan cardiologists. They won't even reply to a comment about fasting insulin. They won't even justify it because I think they know that if you start checking fasting insulins, you're going to see immediately that, yeah, their A1C came down from 11 to 7.5, but their insulin is still sky high. And I'm sorry, but that's not the solution. I want the A1C to be normal, and I want the fasting insulin to be normal too, because that's the numbers you see when you check a hunter-gatherer population who's super, super healthy and they have no heart disease whatsoever. Both of them are normal, and you can't have them both normal. On the most well-balanced, well-formulated vegan diet, you're going to have hyperinsulinemia in anybody over the age of 30. They're either going to be in starvation mode where they're literally just not eating enough food and they're very frail. They've got osteopenia. Their teeth are getting loose. Their skin is saggy and looks terrible. If they're actually eating enough food, they're going to have hyperinsulinemia. And we saw a huge pushback from the vegan cardiology community on Twitter when we started recommending continuous glucose monitors. It's like you need a CGM and you want to keep that line as normal for as many hours a day as possible. And they were in an uproar, Jesse. They're like, you don't need that. This is gonna cause eating disorders. It's like, what are you talking about? People wanting to have a normal blood sugar, that's an eating disorder now? I don't think so. I think that's people being interested in their health, motivated to improve their health. I think that's a good thing. I don't think that's a bad thing in any way. And you get pushed back immediately, or typically you get ignored if you talk about a fasting insulin level, because they know it's going to be high. And then how are they going to explain to their patient, well, yeah, you're not as severe a type 2 diabetic now as you were. You're on 3 diabetic medications and your fasting insulin is also high. They don't want to have that conversation, so they just pretend like fasting insulin doesn't exist. And it's sad. And I hope it's changing a little bit each day. And that's part of the reason I do the work I do, is to try to change that paradigm. But currently, that's the way it is. If you have a doctor who believes in a plant-based diet, and I don't want any doctor out there to blindly believe in any diet, including carnivore or keto. I don't want you to blindly believe that. I want you to understand the physiology behind it. Then if you think you understand the physiology, then you can promote a specific diet, and then we can have a conversation about that. But if you just believe it because somebody you look up to said it, you're not a very good doctor.
You took the words out of my mouth. I'm glad you went to the fasting insulin, because when we start talking hemoglobin A1C and bringing that down, it could just be the body compensating, making more insulin, regulating that blood sugar, and really masking what's happening behind the scenes. So if we don't get to the fasting insulin, we're not really getting to the root of what's happening.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that's why the vegan cardiologists don't want to talk about a fasting insulin. They think it's a superfluous test that doesn't serve any purpose. But if you understand the human physiology of glucose, insulin, and glucagon, you immediately understand why the fasting insulin or a C-peptide, that's mandatory. If you're going to pretend to manage any patient's pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes or MODY or LADA, if you're going to pretend to be the doctor in that situation and manage that, you damn well better be checking a fasting insulin and or a C-peptide, or you're just a bystander with an opinion. That's all you are, because you're not checking the bedrock physiology of what's going on in that patient's body.
The other test I'd be curious to, for somebody that feels like they're healthy and they're doing all the right things, is getting a CT or MRI and seeing what's going on with visceral fat. And I feel like this is becoming more and more of a conversation. I know you write about it in your latest book. Visceral fat, people can appear to be normal weight on the outside and have all kinds of trouble happening on the inside. So let's get into what that is and what causes that.
Yeah, visceral adiposity is a huge marker of metabolic disease. And so there are several ways that you can kind of detect it without spending the money for a full body MRI, which that's the gold standard, but that's super expensive. No insurance is going to pay for that, and many patients can't afford that. I recently had a discussion with Dr. Sean O'Mara, and he's a big proponent of that. And for patients who can afford it, absolutely get a whole body MRI. That's going to show deliberately how much fatty viscera you have. And so in the same way that we fatten up cows so that the ribeye is marbled and beautiful and tastes delicious by feeding them grains and corn and other grass seeds, that works for humans as well. And so humans can suffer from fatty liver. They can also have fatty pancreas. And most doctors have never heard of that, and no patient has heard of that unless they watch my YouTube channel. You can have fatty heart, you can have fatty lung, you can have fatty tongue. Vast majority of people with sleep apnea have fatty tongue. If you do an MRI of their oral pharynx, you can see the marbling in their tongue muscle just like a ribeye. And you can also have fatty muscle in your legs or in your arms. And so when you're eating too many carbohydrates, your body's trying to put that somewhere. It turns it to fat and stores it. When you get fatty liver, that's the first step towards type 2 diabetes. When you get fatty pancreas, you're either severe pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic. And so checking visceral fat is a huge thing. And most doctors have no idea how to do it. Now, the way the average person can get it checked relatively inexpensively is to get a DEXA scan, which is historically used to check bone density. And so a lot of women will have heard of a DEXA scan because that's how they get their bone density checked. But you can also flip a couple of little buttons on the DEXA scan and it'll check visceral fat. And so for about $100, you can get that done. And if your doctor refuses to order it, you can go to the average diagnostic imaging center, and you don't even need a doctor's order. You can get it checked, and they'll charge you 70, 80, 100, 150 bucks. And then now you know, am I truly metabolically healthy? And this is where it really, I think, does the most good is for people who are skinny, right? They're like, no, I eat pure junk all the time, and I look at me, I'm the picture of health, until you check that DEXA scan or that CAT scan or that MRI. And then you see all this visceral fat, and you see usually sarcopenia. They don't have nearly as much truncal muscle as they should have, and they've got way too much intra-organ fat in the liver and in the pancreas and other organs, but also fat surrounding those organs inside the visceral fat. And that they're in some cases they're actually at higher risk of heart attack and stroke than somebody who's just fat on the outside.
You mentioned Dr. Sean. I recently chatted with him as well. And the way I understand it from him is that when you get this fat around your organs, that's going to make your inflammation in the body go up, which ties back to the heart disease that you were talking about earlier.
And
So
the
we're putting the whole picture
vasovasorum
together.
and the glycocalyx. That's exactly right. It all ties together. Yes.
So you mentioned there DEXA scan. Is there any value in just taking a measurement around the waist?
Yeah, for people who just have no financial resources at all, you can buy a $2 Taylor's tape, and you can do what's called a waist to height ratio. And so you measure your height in inches or centimeters, and then you measure your waist at the biggest part, usually right around the belly button, the place where you don't want to measure your waist. That's where you measure it in inches or centimeters, and you keep the units the same, and then you divide the waist by the height. And if that number is greater than 0.55, you've got some degree of visceral adiposity. And the higher that number is, the worse your visceral adiposity is, and the more danger that you're in. So waist to height ratio, that's a great way to just measure this at home. If you don't have the financial resources to get a DEXA scan or an MRI, you can do that. And if it's above 0.55, you need to work on lowering that. And the way you lower that, again, is to eat a very, very low carbohydrate diet. That's step one. And then step two is start to do some kind of high intensity exercise, either weight bearing or sprinting or swimming or cycling super fast to start to burn off that visceral fat. And once you've reversed that, and you've got clean coronary arteries, it's almost like a 10-year guarantee that you're not going to have a heart attack for the next 10 years.
Let's come back to the thesis of this conversation, which is meat. We're defending meat in all different cases. It started out with type 2 diabetes, then we moved into saturated fat. The other big one that comes up is cancer. So for somebody who's been avoiding that, adopting a plant-based diet or a high amount of plants in the diet because of that, let's debunk that one.
Okay. So all of the research showing or implying that eating red meat or eating processed meat increases your risk of colon cancer. And that's the most common cancer that people are going to talk about from eating red meat or eating processed meat, eating bacon. Well, again, that's an extraordinary claim because we've been eating red meat the entire time we've been here. Right? So you better have really good evidence to support that. Well, the World Health Organization actually came out and said that processed meat is a probable carcinogen, and that red meat is a possible or probable carcinogen. The World Health Organization, they would never say something like that without having just concrete evidence. Now, if the average person believed what I just said, could you blame them? It's the freaking World Health Organization. Of course, you're going to just believe that they would never say anything unless they've got black and white proof. Well, the research that they use to make that recommendation is exactly the same kind of research that they use to say that type 2 diabetes is caused by red meat or that heart disease is caused by red meat. It was observational epidemiological research, prospective cohort studies where they would follow a large amount of people. But there's all these biases that can get into that kind of research. There's healthy user bias that we talked about. There's the researcher's preconceived notion. What the researcher believes can actually leach into the research results if you don't blind the study. And that's why we talk about double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trials, is because you not only don't want the participant to know if they're getting the real thing or the placebo, you also don't want the researcher to know. There's a reason we do double-blinded studies, Jesse, and it's because not only will the participant cheat, the researcher will also cheat because at the end of the day, they're both just dudes and chicks. They're both just humans, and everybody wants to win. Everybody wants to be right, and everybody wants to get paid. That's just the truth of the matter. And that's not evil. That's just human nature. We all want to get paid and go home and have fun. Well, for a researcher, if they've got a hypothesis, you read the research enough, Jesse, to know that if you do a study that disproves your hypothesis, known as a negative study, you know how many of those get published in large, high-impact journals? Virtually none, right? Virtually none. Nobody wants to publish a negative study that didn't prove anything, right? They want to publish positive studies that have a high impact that people are going to go, wait, what? Then you can put an article in the New York Times saying red meat causes diabetes, and everybody will read that and click on your link. And you'll have your paper will be a super high impact paper, and you'll be famous and you'll get a raise. Yeah, researchers are susceptible to the same exact temptations as every other human on the planet. So we have to blind the researchers so they don't know either, especially when we're doing drug trials. Now, you can't really do double-blinded randomized controlled trials with food because people know whether they're eating bacon or whether it's not bacon. You can tell. And the researcher can tell from the smell whether it was bacon or placebo bacon. So you can't do that, but you can design studies that effectively tie the hands of the researcher, if not blind the researcher. Such as the study that I intimated earlier. Let's take 100 carnivores and 100 vegans and let's follow them for the next 5 years. It's going to be real hard to cheat there because if you try to give a carnivore broccoli, they're going to know. And they're going to say, no, I ain't eating that. And if you try to give a vegan bacon, they're going to say, no, I ain't eating that. Right? It's hard to trip that study up. That's why I predict it'll never be done. Does that answer the question, or do we need to go further?
No, that's good. And it seems like, yeah, we've been debunking all these different myths when it comes to
let me
red
say
meat.
this, Jesse. I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me say this. I'm not even trying to debunk a plant-based diet. I'm actually not even trying to promote a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet. I'm just saying, with regards to this study that everybody's hearing about right now, I'm just saying, not even as a scientist, just as a layman, don't come at me with an extraordinary claim unless you've got extraordinary evidence to back up that claim. I think that's a rational request that every human has a right to say, don't come at me with some extraordinary claim. Oh, drinking water's bad for me. Oh, breathing air is bad for me. Oh, eating red meat's bad for me. My species has been doing all three of those things for the same length of time. Don't come at me telling me that now water or air or red meat's bad for me unless you have some damn good research. Otherwise, you're wasting my time. At best, you're wasting my time. At worst, you're tricking me into eating the high carb, highly processed, highly inflammatory crap that's made by Kellogg's and Post and General Mills and Mondelez and PepsiCo and Coca-Cola. You're actually harming my health when you come at me with an extraordinary claim with no research to back that up. You're actually doing humanity a disservice. You're not doing anybody a service except for the big corporations who are now going to make everything out of plants and make $1 billion profit. Now, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, Jesse. I want to believe that everybody has good intentions. But at some point, when Harvard School of Public Health keeps coming at me and my patients and my followers with extraordinary claims that red meat is the devil, at some point, we all, as rational adults, have to go, what's their motive? Why are they doing that?
All right, so you've made it clear red meat is good. One word you've been using to describe red meat is fatty. So I want to talk more about that piece. Are we talking about, there's a variety of different cuts when it comes to steaks and different percentages of fat when it comes to ground beef.
Yeah.
How much fat are we talking, and why is that piece important?
Yeah, so the two most satiating macronutrients, I don't think anybody would argue this, is protein and fats. And so many people they'll try to include more meat in their diet, but they'll eat only the leanest cuts. And so they wind up effectively eating a higher protein, high carb, but inadequate fat. And so they're hungry all the time. You're going to fail if your goal is weight loss, or if your goal is reversing type 2 diabetes. If you're hungry all the time, you're going to fail. You're not going to reach your goal. And so It's very clear in the anthropological literature that we always ate the fat that came with the meat. We would go out of our way to get the fat around the eyeballs or the fat around the kidneys. This is documented time and time and time again in anthropological research. Now, it may sound gross to modern people. They're like, no, I only want it skinless. I don't even want the skin on my chicken breast, much less the fat around the eyeballs, Dr. Berry. I get it. I understand. But that's social programming. That's the social meme that you currently believe in. But healthy humans always eat the fat that comes with the meat. It also, if you're trying to lose weight or you're trying to reverse fatty liver or you're trying to reverse type 2 diabetes or hypertension, or the list goes on and on, if you have a goal, a health goal, then you've got to be satiated after your meals. You've got to be full, and you've got to stay full for many hours after your meal, right? You're not going to do that if you're eating a high carb, low protein diet. Even with lots of fat, you're still going to be munching all the time. That's basically the Pepsi Cola and Dorito and honey bun diet. High sugar, high fat. You're going to be hungry all the time. You're not getting enough protein. You're not being satiated. If you try to do a high carb, high protein diet, for most people, they're not going to be satiated. They're going to keep snacking. And every time you snack, what happens to your insulin level? Every time you put carbs or protein in your mouth, your insulin goes up, right? More with carbs, but still some with protein. So you've got hyperinsulinemia. You're hungry all the time. You're having to eat snacks in between meals and a bedtime snack, and you're not losing the weight, or you're not lowering the A1C. The sweet spot is to eat an adequate protein, adequate fat diet, as low in carbohydrates as possible. Now, there's a ton of argument right now on Twitter and other places about, should it be high protein, adequate fat, or should it be high fat, adequate protein? What I tell people is I don't care. Try 90 days both ways, because you're going to discover what works best for your particular DNA on that normal distribution curve. I don't know if you fall here or right in the fat middle. I don't know. But you can find out yourself by doing 90 days of high protein, adequate fat, very low carb. If that works for you, huzzah, I love it. But if that doesn't work for you, then you're going to do 90 days of high fat, still adequate protein, very, very low carb. And one of those two is going to work for you and your health improvement, your health optimization goals. Then you win, and therefore I win. Because my goal is for you to be healthy. That's why I do this each and every day. And so I don't care if it's high protein, adequate fat, or high fat, adequate protein. Either one is infinitely better for you than high carb, shitty fat, moderate protein. That's the literal worst diet on the planet. And there's lots of vegan influencers saying, oh, there's lots of protein in plants. I think the research, again, is very clear in animal biology and human biology studies that plant protein is not as effective as animal protein. It's just not. I'm sorry. I wish it were. Having a fight on Twitter yesterday with a vegan who says that we make all the amino acids we need. We don't need to. There's no such thing as an essential amino acid. That we don't make. There's no essential vitamins. We can make all the vitamins. We just have to eat calories. Literally said that. And this is a registered dietitian. And I'm like, man, I don't know what planet you're from. But the planet I'm on and all the people that I'm trying to help, we know that we need to have adequate amino acids from protein and adequate fatty acids from fat and adequate minerals and adequate vitamins, or our health is going to suffer. We just know this. How you don't know this, I'm not sure, but there are people out there like that.
Well, you've made it clear for people, it's an individual thing when it comes to the protein and fat. We need to experiment, find out the ratio best for us. But to get into the nuance for you when it comes to fatty meat, are you avoiding steaks, say, that are a leaner cut? Are you adding, say, like butter on top of your fatty steak to increase the fat? I'm just trying to get into the nuance of what that looks like for you.
Yeah. And so for me, I'm the guy over here on this end of the curve that fattens very easily. I was 297 pounds at my fattest. I developed type 2 diabetes very easily. I had severe prediabetes and didn't even know it because I was just living my life as an ER doc and as a family doctor. And so I have to follow a high fat, adequate protein, super low carbohydrate diet to keep all my health markers, all those markers I talked about previously, to keep those all normal, I have to follow that diet. And so I'll have a fatty ribeye. I've got a friend who's a butcher. I've got a friend who's a meat processor. And not everybody can afford that, and you don't have to do that. We'll talk about how expensive your meat needs to be in a second if you want to, Jesse. But I tell my butcher, never trim the fat. I want the fat that comes with the pork chop, the fat that comes with the ribeye. And in some cases, I'll get a giant ribeye and it's got a cap of fat on it that's 1.5 inches thick. My lamb chops have a 3/4 inch fat cap on them. If you trim the fat on my meat, you're no longer my butcher. And he's well aware of that. And so I have to have that fat in order to stay satiated, because if not, I'll be in here in the cabinets at 8 p.m. rummaging around trying to find a snack. My markers of inflammation will be going up. My A1C will be starting to creep up. My triglycerides will start to creep up very quickly if I don't eat enough protein and enough saturated fat, animal fat, to keep me satiated and to keep me from wanting to snack. I've been a snacker my entire life. And I discovered my prediabetes, 8-9 years ago, and started out trying to reverse it with primal paleo. That helped a tiny bit, not much. Keto, 80% of all my problems gone. Carnivore, fixed it and kept it fixed for 5.5 years now. So that, for me personally, that's what it has to be. And for the vast majority of people who come to either keto, ketovore, carnivore with their primary goal being weight loss, they have to do high fat, adequate protein. That's the sweet spot for them to lose the stored fat. And then for so many people, I know somebody right now listening to this, their head is exploding. They're like, this doctor just said to eat more fat to lose fat. How the hell does that make sense? And when you really dig into the human physiology, it does make sense. Because the ultimate goal here is to be satiated, to not be hungry constantly, and to have a very low insulin level in your blood. When your insulin level gets to a low enough point, you start to burn body fat effortlessly. You don't even have to exercise. We've got people who have lost 200 pounds who are paraplegics in a wheelchair, and they don't exercise at all. And we have people who come to the conferences all the time saying, I thought you were full of crap, because I weighed 450 pounds. And you said, I watched The Biggest Loser. They're on the treadmill. Everybody I watch, they're like, oh, you've got to exercise or you're going to fail. I just literally sat in my recliner for a year and ate beef, butter, bacon, and eggs. And I lost 200 pounds of fat. And I know it was fat because some of these people have the financial means to get a DEXA scan or to get a full body MRI. And guess what was preserved while they lost 200 pounds of stored body fat? Their bone density was preserved. Their muscle density and their muscle percentage was preserved on a diet of nothing but beef, butter, bacon, and eggs, and then maybe liver, some kind of liver, one serving a week. They lost almost no muscle, but they lost this extraordinary amount of fat, not exercising. And in some cases, a few of them even put on muscle, even though they weren't exercising. It's almost like that when you're eating fatty meat, your body understands what you're doing, and you'll start to put on, not a Arnold Schwarzenegger amount of muscle, but you'll start to actually increase your muscle strength and density and your muscle percentage to a certain degree, because your body understands, oh, you're getting healthy again. You're getting ready to hunt. I need to get you in shape. Now, obviously, to have show muscle, you're going to have to lift weights. Everybody knows that. I'm not implying that you can have show muscles sitting in the recliner eating beef, butter, bacon, and eggs, but I'm just telling you what we've seen. We've seen black and white studies again and again and again from people sharing their lab work with us, sharing their DEXA scans, sharing their MRIs. If they can afford that, yeah, you can do that without exercise, and then now let's talk about the price of the meat. There's this subset of carnivores, subset of health gurus out there that say you're going to destroy your health unless you only eat grass-fed, grass-finished, that's been only, grazed on the slopes of the Himalayan mountains from the, month of March to May. That's the only kind of beef you can eat. It costs $200 a pound, but that's you. And also I sell that. You can get a box from me once a month of that Panda massage meat. No, no. Is grass-finished beef a little bit better than feedlot beef? Yes, it is. It's anywhere from 3 to 6% better with regards to the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, to the omega-3 profile. It's going to have more vitamins and minerals, but is it a deal breaker for somebody who cannot afford $22 an ounce beef? No, it's not. We've had hundreds of people, Jesse, in our private group lose almost 100 pounds, if not more, eating the big 5-pound sticks of the cheapest beef that you can buy at the discount grocery. And it's not, there's nothing magic in any of the beef. That's the thing. People, once they get that paradigm shift, they're like, oh, I get it. So grass finished is better, but it's not mandatory. I can eat any beef. Like literally, I've had people lose almost 100 pounds eating Spam and hot dogs and bologna because they chose the lowest carb version with the fewest added things. They try to get just pure meat, hot dogs, pure meat bologna. And Spam's going to have some carbs in it, but not many. If you compare it to Lucky Charms or Doritos or Pepsi Cola, it's very low carb. And so if previously they were eating a junk diet and they start just literally eating nothing but eggs, bologna, hot dogs, and Spam, they'll lose weight like crazy because they're keeping that insulin level down low, much lower than it was when they were eating the Lucky Charms and the Doritos. They'll lose all that stored fat. They'll lose the fat stored in their liver and in their pancreas. They'll start to lose the visceral fat. And then guess what happens, Jesse, after a few months of losing that weight while sitting in the recliner? All of a sudden, they feel like doing something that they haven't felt like doing in sometimes decades. You know what it is? Exercise. They actually feel like exercising, and I don't have to yell at them and berate them and belittle them to get them to exercise. They'll pop up and say, guess what I did yesterday? I went and walked a mile. It's the first time in 20 years. It was amazing. I didn't think I'd ever be able to do that again. Thank you so much. And it's not because of any magic that I'm performing. It's just because they finally honored their species. They honored their physiology. They honored their biochemistry by eating a proper human diet. And as soon as you start to do that, your body, no matter how sick it is currently, immediately it says, thank you. I'll get to work healing now. It's literally that simple.
And you can see how once you start to make, some of these steps, inertia is going to start building. You're going to start to feel physically better, mentally better. The weight's going to fall off. You're going to begin exercising. And as you continue to learn and add new things in, you're going to get better and better, break this cycle that was going the other way, and then get your life back.
Absolutely. We've got people who 2 years ago, they were in a wheelchair most of the day. They could stand up, but they literally would just transfer from the wheelchair to the toilet, wheelchair to the couch. When they went to the grocery, they were the person in the scooter. They were that sick and that obese, who now reach out to us in our private group, and they're telling me how many 40-yard sprints that they did yesterday. Now, can you imagine the feeling of pride for somebody who used to literally have trouble transferring from a wheelchair to the toilet? Had to have help doing that. They're now out in the backyard doing wind sprints. If you could go back in time and tell that person, 3 years from now, you're going to be doing wind sprints in the backyard, they'd probably try their best to slap you because they would think you were mocking them. That kind of transformation is absolutely possible. It's happening every day when you honor your physiology and your biochemistry and you eat a proper human diet. Your body will go back depending on how much permanent damage you've done, right? We always have to say, well, you smoked for 40 years. You drank a fifth of whiskey a day for 40 years. You lived on Pepsi, Cheetos, and Ding Dongs for 40 years. You've probably done some permanent damage. But the degree with which the body can heal, it's just almost miraculous when you stop the slow poison that is the standard Western diet and start eating a proper human diet. The degree of healing sometimes is almost miraculous, and it makes me want to tear up every time I hear one of those, because that's what I used to dream about doing, Jesse, back when I was 12 years old, watching reruns of MASH and Trapper John MD and Quincy MD and dreaming about being a doctor. I wanted to heal people. I wanted to transform people from sick to well. And I now get to do that on a daily basis. Not because of some invention of mine, but because with many other people, we've just kind of stumbled around in the dark until we've rediscovered what a proper human diet is. And then when we recommend that to somebody, and then the next step is they actually listen and say, okay, this sounds crazy, but I'm going to try it for 90 days. That's it. That's when the seeming magic happens. Because at the end of that 90 days, the vast majority of people say, I'm never going back to the way I used to eat. That would be suicide, effectively, if I went back to eating that way. And most people are not suicidal. They'd actually like to be healthy if it is indeed possible.
And the great thing about all this is that it's approachable for everybody. You've already alluded, well, you've gotten into the details of the fact that it doesn't need to be this pristine, high quality meat for people that can't afford it. And it's a very simple diet. You're telling people eat more meat, cut down the carbs. Like, this is very approachable.
Yep.
It's very simplified, and people really, I can't think of any excuses for people that have been struggling not to give this a try.
No, exactly. And indeed, that's what we see is the only people who don't do this are the people who are just not mentally ready. They've got a ton of crap going on in their life. They're just so depressed they can barely get off the couch. They're just not ready to make any change. But the instant that somebody is like, okay, fine, I'll try this for 30 days. I'll do 60. I'll do 90. When they make that commitment, that's when the seeming magic begins, which is just physiology working in the background. But after they see what that 30 days did, what that 60 or 90 days did, they're sold. And then they're the carnivore evangelist out trying to convince their mother-in-law, you got to try this. This is amazing. And it annoys people. But you can just imagine if you literally thought the remainder of your life was going to be short and miserable and full of doctor's visits and full of handfuls of pills for the rest of your life, and now you're in the backyard running wind sprints, you're off all your medicines, you had to buy all new clothes because nothing you had fits anymore, you sold your wheelchair on eBay. When you go to the supermarket now, you don't care if there's an available scooter or not because you don't need that. How could you not shout that from the rooftops? Of course, you're going to be trying to get everybody you care about to give this a 90-day try because you know what it did for you.
Let's address some of the worst offending foods for people that say are adopting a proper human diet but still have some carbohydrates. Say they're around that 100 grams of carbs. And the first one I want to address is seed oils. And I think this can be one that really trips people up. They can hide in different foods. Talk about those. And again, somebody in your case where you're eating a carnivore diet, I can't see how those would get into your diet, but for somebody that's going to have some carbs.
Right. And so we see amazing transformations in people who get all of the vegetable seed oils out of their diet. Now, I'm an honest guy. I'll shoot you straight. The research supporting removing seed oils from your diet is not nearly as robust as the research saying you should eat a low-carb diet. That research, in my opinion, is very clear and very solid. But the vegetable seed oil research, I don't think is as clear. But that's always been one of my first three steps. Step one, get rid of all sugar out of your diet. Step two, get rid of all grains out of your diet because they turn into sugar. And step three, get rid of all the vegetable seed oils. That's been my mantra since 2017. That's the first three steps of adopting a proper human diet. And so for many people, and remember the normal distribution curve, I think there's a subset of people that vegetable seed oils are very inflammatory, just the least amount. Some people, if they eat too much, it's going to be inflammatory. Some people seemingly can eat a lot of vegetable seed oils, and it doesn't really seem to affect their inflammatory markers or anything else that we can currently detect. But out of an abundance of caution, vegetable seed oils have only been around 100 years. Literally, if you went back in time 200 years, nobody would know what you were talking about. If you said, I want to fry this in cottonseed oil or canola oil or soybean oil, they would be like, where are you from? I don't even know what you're talking about. We fry stuff in beef tallow. We fry stuff in bacon grease. We use suet. We use you know, I forget the chicken fat. We use animal fat to cook in. That's what we cook in here. We don't know what this vegetable oil you're talking about is. So if something's only been in our diet for 100 years, that obviously cannot be ancestrally appropriate. It cannot be part of a proper human diet. That's an improper food. So I remove it out of an abundance of caution. And we see people who their inflammatory markers get much, much better with that. But I would say the most offensive, most dangerous foods are the highly processed things that contain three ingredients: sugar, grains, vegetable seed oils. So that's going to be any ready to eat breakfast cereal. That's going to be any pastry, any strudel, any cookie, any cake, any pie. Anything like that is going to be a combination. And that also includes pizza crust. It also includes tortillas. It also includes nachos, right? When that's one thing that wakes a lot of people up when you start to look at all the things that you can make with sugar, grains, and vegetable seed oils. It looks like you've got this huge variety of foods at the supermarket, right? Oh no, I eat the rainbow. No, really, 99% of your diet is sugar, grains, and vegetable seed oils. And only when you understand that, you're like, oh, so stay out of the middle of the store. Buy food from the produce section, buy food from the meat section, maybe some food from the dairy, buy some nuts, buy some berries. That's real food. Don't go in the middle of the section where everything's in a cardboard box and is some ratio of sugar, grains, and vegetable seed oils. That's the number 1, 2, and 3 things. If people get that out of their diet, for many people, that takes them close to that 100 total grams of carbs a day. And they immediately start to get healthy if they're over on this end of the distribution curve, right? They immediately start to lose weight. Their A1C's coming down. They're getting better. They're feeling better. Their inflammation's better. They feel like exercising. For some people, that's not that. Those first 3 steps help them, but it doesn't get them to the goal line where they want to be. And so anything that's highly processed that contains sugar, grains, and vegetable seed oils, that's literally the most dangerous, most inflammatory, most unhealthy thing you can eat.
Earlier, when you talked about that range of carbs within the proper human diet, you talked about when we get down, I think it was around 20, it becomes ketosis.
Yeah. Ketogenic for most people. That's right.
So,
Yeah.
do you see additional benefits from producing ketones and being that low, specifically from the ketone aspect?
Yeah. And so we know there's credible research that shows clearly that cardiac myocytes, the heart muscle cells, they pump more efficiently when they're fed on ketones and fatty acids than when they're fed with sugar. I keep hearing on Twitter that your brain needs sugar. But when I reach out to these people and say, which specific neurons, which specific cells, is it astrocytes, is it glial cells, which one needs sugar? I never get an answer to that question. And so until proven otherwise, I think that the brain runs better on ketones than it runs on sugar. I think the heart cell, that's been shown pretty definitively that it runs better. Once you become keto adapted, which for some people it takes 3 days, some people it takes 3 weeks, meaning that basically you ramp up the biochemical machinery that allow your muscles to burn ketones and allow everything to burn ketones optimally. Then you start having long distance triathletes who are completing entire races and placing very high in ketosis the entire race. They're not slamming the sugar gels or the sugar drinks anymore. They're actually burning their own body fat while they run. Ultra marathoners are starting to do this. Bodybuilders, there's several bodybuilders who are natural, winning competitions with none of the steroids and none of the sugars. They're literally in ketosis and they're checking their ketones and posting that saying, look, I just won this natty competition and I was in ketosis my entire training. How is that possible if the muscles need glucose? That should be impossible, but here it is. And so I think that there are multiple benefits to being in ketosis at least part of the day, if not constantly. I think some of the benefits of ketosis, like I said earlier about another subject, I think there are benefits to ketosis that we haven't even discovered yet because everybody's been so interested in researching the next pharmaceutical breakthrough because that's $1 billion paycheck, right? But if you find some new thing that being in ketosis does, okay, you don't make any money for that. You just get to keep your job. So congrats, I guess. So researchers aren't really interested in looking at the benefits of this. But I think that we know the brain works better. We know the heart works better. We know that the muscles are absolutely capable of doing this, running on ketones and fatty acids. So where's the downside? So yeah, I think ketosis is very valuable. I don't know yet if you need to be in ketosis all the time or if you just need to have periods of ketosis and then periods where you're not in ketosis. I don't think the research is clear on that yet. But last time I checked clinicaltrials.gov, there were over 430 ongoing trials right now that have either been registered or are actually in progress looking at a ketogenic diet, a diet that puts you in ketosis for this malady, this disease, this condition, ranging all the way from very rare genetic conditions up to depression, up to dementia, to seizure disorder. Like there's over 400 studies ongoing right now. And if anybody doubts that, just go to clinicaltrials.gov and type in keto, and it'll tell you exactly how many trials have been registered that are going to start soon or that are already underway looking at ketosis as a therapeutic state. And indeed, there are many people in the ketogenic sphere now, MDs and PhDs, who are saying that the default state for humans is ketosis. And that's very controversial if you say that in a mixed audience. But I can't disagree with them. But then also when somebody says, no, it's good to dip into ketosis, but you need to come out, I don't think we know yet. But I think that some of the anthropological evidence based on what people actually ate that we can detect through stable isotope analysis, I think those guys were in ketosis almost all the time. And they obviously did well enough to reproduce and then live to be 70 or 80 because that's when we found their skeleton and reproduce successfully. And so I don't know that the answer to that, but I don't think there's any provable danger to being in ketosis all the time, as you'll hear some influencers say. I don't think there's any research that supports that whatsoever. But I don't know if it's optimal to be in ketosis all the time or if it's optimal to go in and out of ketosis. I don't think we know the answer to that yet. And I'm happy to believe either way as the research leads me.
I know this isn't an animal product, but how do you feel about, say, a C8 MCT oil, adding that to coffee, adding that to a salad dressing for people that are introducing some carbs to their diet and using that to artificially boost ketones?
Yeah, I have no problem with coconut oil or MCT oil. I have no problem with real avocado oil or real olive oil. And you know as well as I do that those two are often adulterated because you can adulterate them with safflower or canola or soybean, and nobody can tell the difference unless they have a biochemistry lab. And so you actually make more money on your olive oil or your avocado oil, and that ain't even what it is. But if it's real, I think that fruit seed oils, which is what olive and avocado are, I think they're probably fine. And then coconut oil, I think, is probably fine. Another way to look at that is you can also make all three of those on your kitchen stove. You don't need a chemical factory, right, or a petroleum distillation setup to make those oils. Those oils are oils that humans have been making for thousands of years. So I think they're probably fine. Now, remember the normal distribution curve. I think there's probably a subset of people that need 100% animal fat. And I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I've talked to many people who's like, if I get off carnivore at all, I start to have inflammation or I start to have this, that, or the other. But I think the vast majority of people can tolerate some coconut oil, avocado oil, olive oil just fine in their diet. And I think for many people that's more of a gateway. Like, yeah, I can walk through that gateway. It doesn't sound nearly as weird as no, everything has to be cooked in beef tallow or bacon grease. You know, that for some people are like, what? So I'm totally fine with somebody ending up at carnivore because they started with low carb, real whole foods. I'm having, and wherever anybody falls on that spectrum, from low carb with real whole food, all the way over to pure 100% lion diet carnivore, as long as they attain their best health, I'm happy. That spectrum, I think, is where every single human on the planet, their best health falls somewhere on that spectrum. of low carb, real whole food to lion diet carnivore. And I don't think that in years to come, I don't think anybody will even try to argue with that. Human beings are by design low carbohydrate mammals.
Ken, as somebody in his mid 50s, you co wrote a book, Kicking Ass After 50. I have a good portion of my audience as males that are in that age range. One of the things that tends to come up when people get to that range is low testosterone. And in that book, you wrote about this. So I want to address this issue for people that are in that boat. What might they be doing to start off that's depleting that?
Yeah, and so when you eat a diet that's full of carbohydrates and that's low in animal fat and animal proteins, and you're sedentary and therefore losing muscle mass, you're going to have low T. That's just going to happen. Okay. Now, in the past, we would say, oh, as you get older, your testosterone goes down. But I have trouble honoring that trope anymore because I've seen multiple hundreds of men in their 50s, 60s, and even 70s. I've got guys in our private group, they have a T-shirt that says "Kicking Ass After 70" to honor the book, but they're like, I'm way past 50 and I'm still kicking ass. And so what we see is when you have a sedentary guy eating a high carb diet, you check his testosterone, it's 250 or 200 or 150. And you put that guy on a fatty red meat diet. And then once he's eaten that diet long enough that he's actually lost some weight, lowered the inflammation, lowered the insulin, and now he's feeling better, to get up out of the recliner, to get up off the couch, and he starts to lift heavy things, right? Join the gym and work out, or just go out in the garage and lift 2 car batteries. I don't care. It doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to stress your muscles and stress your bones. Start sprinting in the backyard. You can wear your work boots for all I care. I don't care. I just want you doing hard things physically. When you start to do that, we've got guys in our private group who have increased their testosterone with no testosterone injections, no pellets, no creams, anywhere from 50 up to 400 points. Documented before and after total testosterones went up 400 points after 3 months of carnivore and lifting heavy things. Now, for the vast majority of guys, if you raise their testosterone 400 points, huzzah, they don't need any other help. But there are some guys that even after they've done it all, carnivore and lifting heavy things, it'll only go up 50 or 100 points, and then they're still hanging out at 250, 300, 350, and they're just still don't feel like it. And I'm 100% an advocate. After you've done the work, you've done carnivore and you lift heavy things for 90 days, if your T is still low, go find somebody that does bioidentical hormone optimization and get your testosterone optimized. There's not a shred of research that proves that optimizing your testosterone increases your risk of heart disease. There's not a shred of research that shows that it increases your risk of prostate cancer. All of that is bullshit that's based on the same epidemiological research that we started this conversation with. When you actually look at the hard data, there's either no proof either way with testosterone optimization that it causes or prevents, or there's actually research that shows that it prevents heart disease or prevents prostate cancer if the testosterone you're replacing with is bioidentical.
Do you recommend when men get to a certain age, they go and have testing done to objectively see where their testosterone level is, or should they just base it symptom-wise? And if the latter, what symptoms should they keep an eye out for?
Yeah, I used to recommend that, Jesse. Everybody after the age of 50, you need to have this checked. But now I'm coming to see that if you feel great, if you sleep great, if you're full of energy, full of motivation, if the most attractive thing in your house is not the recliner, right? If you've got somebody who you've got your sexual eye on and you're taking care of business in the bedroom, I don't give a damn what your total testosterone, your free testosterone, your sex hormone binding globulin. If all that stuff is working, if this is working, if both heads are working, I don't really think it's mandatory that you get those tests checked, because I've seen time and time again, I'll check a guy and his testosterone is 450, let's say, but he's rocking life, rocking mentally, physically, sexually, everything is on. And then we'll replace it and get him up to 800. He comes in 3 months later. He's like, I still feel great. I don't feel any more greater, right? It's the guys with symptoms. And I think this goes for women with menopause too. I think there are women who going through menopause, documentable by checking their labs, they feel fine. They got no symptoms. They don't have any problem sleeping. Everything's fine. I don't think they necessarily need to optimize their hormones. I don't think that's been proven that they need that. And indeed, when I would women, they would come anyway and say, "Well, I feel great, but my friend got these pellets, and I want to get them too." And I'm like, "Well, I don't think it's going to hurt you." And we would do it. They'd be back 3 months later, like, I couldn't tell any difference at all. I still feel just as great as I did before. That's kind of de facto evidence that me raising that man's total testosterone from 450 to 850, I didn't really benefit him, did I? Did I hurt him? I don't think I hurt him. No, I don't think it damaged or harmed, but I also don't think it was worth the money and the time and the inconvenience. So if anybody out there, if you feel amazing, everything works right, your brain, everything, go live your life and have fun. Go outside and play. But if you're not feeling as good as you think you could, you better get the full lab panel that I talk about in the book Common Sense Labs, and you better start honoring the principles that we talk about in Kicking Ass Over 50. And you better start watching some of my YouTube videos, because your default setting is good health. That's your default. And if you're not enjoying good health, you're doing something that's tripping up your body, that's tripping up your metabolism, that's tripping up your physiology.
You mentioned sleep there. That's another one of the things you mentioned in the book. And obviously, that's tied to health as a whole, too. But if somebody is suffering right now with low T, that's something else they want to be tuned into and making sure they're getting restorative sleep. I think in the book, you say at least 7 hours a night.
Yeah. And so the research, again, somewhere between 6 and 9 hours a night. And I think for that, like every other thing in human physiology, there's a normal distribution curve. Some people need 9 hours a night. Some people can get by beautifully on 6 hours a night with no seeming harm. But low T and poor sleep, they go hand in hand. And I think there's a causative element to both. I think if you got low T, you're not going to sleep as well. I think if you have poor sleep, your T is going to be lower. Which is the chicken and which is the egg? I don't care, and I don't know, and I also don't care. I just want you to have great sleep and have a high enough testosterone level that you feel great. And that's the victory. And so for some guys, cleaning up their sleep hygiene and making sure they're doing everything right, starting when the sun goes down, from between then and bedtime. Also, actually starting when the sun comes up, getting that morning sun on their face. That's actually when you start to have good sleep. Every morning, get out in the sunlight. I don't care if it's cloudy, snowing, raining, go outside. Because people don't realize this, but on the cloudiest day outside, it's 100 to 1,000 times brighter than inside your house with every single light in the house turned on bright. It's 100 to 1,000 times brighter outside on the cloudiest, snowy day. And our eyes adjust so quickly that most people, that when you say that, they're like, there's no way that's true. And they have to go look up the lux. They're like, oh shit, that is true. Yeah. And so that morning sunlight on your face every morning, that's one of the first steps to getting better sleep. And then when the sun goes down, your blue light needs to start going down. I'm not a fan of wearing the orange blue blockers all day long. I think that's stupid. Sorry. Yeah, I hope you don't do that, Jesse. But starting when the sun goes down, I do think you need to start thinking about the amount of blue light that's hitting your retina, because you have receptors in there that's looking not only at the color of the light, but also the intensity of the light. And so in our house, we've got a 15-month-old and a 4-year-old and a 54-year-old and a 30-something-year-old, right? When the sun goes down, we start dimming lights and we start switching to red light, not just for me, for my testosterone, not just for Nisha, for her estrogen, but for Beckett and Bonnie, for their developing bones and their developing brains. They need to mimic the pattern that our species has been mimicking for the last 300,000 years. Drink clean water, breathe clean air, eat red meat, and when it gets dark, it's dark. And when the sun comes up, you go out and play in it. That is a proper human life. And when you do those key things, everything gets better. And you start to realize health that you maybe thought was gone forever at any age.
All right, Ken, we're going to end on this, staying with testosterone here for another minute. For somebody that's tried the things that we've talked about, they're getting a good sleep, they're eating, low carb, red meat, and they're lifting heavy things, but they're not getting that level up. They're only seeing a little bit of an improvement before they go to replacement therapy, actually, the drug route. Are there natural supplements or anything else you can recommend before they go all the way there?
Yeah, there are several things that you'll hear promoted out there on the interwebs and websites and articles, but there's very little research to support any of the natural supplementation to improve testosterone. There's very little research support. And people, I talk about anthropology in the past so much, people think, well, he must not care about. No, I definitely care very much about the latest research on all these subjects. The same for women in menopause. All of the evening primrose and all this and that. The research is equivocal, and I tell everybody before you go the pharmaceutical route, absolutely try every single herb and supplement that you can try. Plus, eating red meat and lifting heavy things, right, and getting good sleep. But then if the supplement route, if it doesn't play out for you, and I can't promise you, oh, if you'll take this specific supplement, it's gonna no, because there's just no research to support that. All I can say is, well, if you want to put off the pharmaceutical route, try this first. Here's the following things to try. And I know a list of those just like you do, Jesse. And half the guys say, I couldn't tell that helped at all. 10% say, I think that maybe helped a little bit. Some will go check their labs. Yeah, it came up 50 points. Was that just lab error or did it actually help? I don't know. We don't have enough research to show one way or the other. So I don't talk about those things a lot, but I'm 100% advocate. Try every non-pharmaceutical method before you finally take the pharmaceutical leap. And yeah, I absolutely believe in that paradigm. You don't ever go to the doctor for pharmaceuticals until you've exhausted every other natural thing that you can try. Absolutely believe that.
Earlier, when you were talking about numbers for testosterone, you got into the fact that it's going to be different for different people, and it's not necessarily the number that matters. But for people who want to have that baseline, I know there's free testosterone, and then what are the two different ones? There's two different tests there for testosterone. What baseline number should people at least know to base where they're at off of?
Yeah. So the total testosterone is what every doctor who's practicing anywhere close to standard of care, that's what you use to diagnose low testosterone, and then also you recheck that to check ongoing testosterone replacement therapy. Insurance companies will actually yell at you if you're using free testosterone to manage somebody. I've actually gotten letters before because I always check a total testosterone, a free testosterone, and a sex hormone binding globulin, but there's no research to support checking free testosterones or sex hormone binding globulin, even though I think they're important. The insurance companies, if you're trying to file insurance for low testosterone, and there is an ICD-10 code for that diagnosis, and then you can get reimbursed if it's low enough, but they keep lowering the number, right, before they'll cover it. But it's total testosterone. That's for the vast majority of doctors who practice this. That's the number they're looking at. And so when I first started doing testosterone optimization back in 2003, if your total testosterone was under 350, then insurance would that was officially hypogonadism. They would cover the treatment. Now it's 249. They've dropped 100 points off. So unless your testosterone is 249 or lower, most of the big insurance companies will not reimburse. Medicare will not reimburse for you to treat that as a medical condition. And I predict they'll lower it even more because they don't want to treat that. And then also getting back to kind of what the unspoken thing that you and I have been talking about this whole time is why in the world would Harvard School of Public Health be recommending a diet that's going to make people metabolically sicker? Why would the insurance companies, why would Medicare be okay with men's testosterone continuously getting lower? I don't know why. But I mean, there are people out there who have theories about this, but at some point, a common sense, rational adult's going to go, what the heck is going on here? Right, Jesse?
I hear you. Ken, Thank you for coming back on the show. Really enjoyed round 2. We're going to link up the books, your YouTube channel, your social media, everything in the show notes. Thank you again, sir.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
Now that you're done with Ken, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Dr. Sean. He's another carnivore MD with a lot to share about visceral fat and how to remove it. I'll see you over there.
Nothing that I'm aware of as a physician whose passion is to help people become the